So when the world, had privatized banks, you had wealth by families. When you can look back at the history, you had, the Rothschild family. They had banks. They levered their interests in order to control governments and create privatized banks. And then they pushed out the central banking model. Like that was one era. But what I've seen is that people get stuck in an old paradigm without the fluidity of how the world actually changes.
Mm-hmm.
So power dynamics change. For example, it used to be ground, it used to be physical land. But now you can have a country that doesn't have that much land, but access to, like Singapore, for example, incredibly powerful because it has access to, these financial products and various other, influence in these choke points. And so you can have you can have strength in something and be very important to the network. But then as technology changes and as financialization changes, power can change significantly. So if you look at the old, banking dynasty families, you had the Warburg family, for example. The Warburg family was a governor in the Reichsbank, which is the bank that funded Nazi Germany and fascism. But also his brother was on the governor on the Federal Reserve. And so you had, Wall Street funded the Bolshevik Revolution during World War I, which took the Communist Manifesto, overthrew the Russian Tsar, and installed the Soviet Union. So similar families installed a central bank in America, were funded Nazi Germany, and were also funding communism.
Wow.
And so these families would hedge and profit from every side of a war. So after World War II, we immediately entered into a Cold War.
Crazy.
And that was the Soviet Union, communism, and fake capitalism, which is a Federal Reserve that creates a debt-based Ponzi scheme in order to consolidate power over to the banks and where we are today. And so you can go down these conspiratorial routes, but what you end up in when you follow the dynamic of how it works today is many of these families structured their wealth into trust companies, offshore trust companies, and those offshore trust companies became exited and became shareholders and would hedge some of their wealth with gold and various other things, neutral assets. But they ended up public companies because going public is the exit strategy.
Right.
And so then once you've got all these banks that are going public, you then had the invention of engineered things like the global financial crisis. When you look at what happened during the global financial crisis, well, the Federal Reserve needed access to data and technology in order to decide which banks to go bust and which ones to bail out. Who was providing that technology? Well, it was BlackRock. And what did BlackRock determine they should do? Well, they should let these banks go bust. They should issue loans to these banks. These ones are the shareholders in the Fed as well, just so happens. And then we should divest Barclays iShares, which is the ETF department that BlackRock controls today. And so by having these ETFs, you essentially got everyone's pension, everyone's endowment money through colleges and universities, everyone's auto loans, everyone's mortgages, everyone's insurance premiums to passively invest and hand over their voting to BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. And then they became shareholders in each other. Mm-hmm. And so BlackRock bought shares in Vanguard, Vanguard bought shares in State Street, Vanguard's still a private company. Yeah. And so you end up with this massive web of, in the end, what I would call a decentralized but unaccountable power structure, which actually does rule the world. But you can make mistakes. It's like nodes, right? Like Bitcoin. You could be running a node for this network, but this network, it doesn't have, it's not governed by maths and code, an algorithm. It's governed by a ruthless game where people can throw each other off the network all the time and power dynamics shift in this network. And so, if you look at BlackRock, they own board seats and shares in over 20,000 companies. And they passively get 12.5 trillion of assets to manage. Across State Street, Vanguard, BlackRock, and others, there's about 25 to $30 trillion of assets. Mm-hmm. Whoever owns those shares rules the world. Now, who owns the vast majority and the voting shares? Well, then you've got a power dynamic that changes. And so when you look at, I answered this question because there's often a conspiracy, right? Let's be frank. People say Jews rule the world is a conspiracy theory, an anti-Semitic trope, whatever you want to call it. But it was because there was originally Christian power needed Jewish power in order to create banks, because it was forbidden to lend at interest by Christian theology. Whereas Jewish theology said, we can't lend to each other, but we can lend to non-Jews. And so the Christian rulers, and I don't mean religiously, I mean rulers that were aligned with Christianity, used essentially Jewish families to create banks. And then that turned into a powerful industry. So over time it becomes more decentralized. But then if you look at, I did a study on this, if you look at wealth today, so this is where I think it's more decentralized and it's fluid, but it's not accountable. It's not accountable to the power structure. People think it's the politicians. Politicians are prostitutes. You pay them to do what you want them to do, and their job is to put a narrative to make you think you're doing it for the people, and that's their job. But at the top of the power structure, for example, I looked at this because people do these conspiracies. The last time someone looked at wealth, and you could question the data, it's on Wikipedia and various other things, data's not perfect, but it said wealth is 55% aligned with those that identify as Christians, 36% aligned with those that identify as atheists, 8% aligned with those that identify as Muslims, 6% aligned with those that identify as Hindus, and 1% aligned with those that identify as Jews. And so you could say that is a gauge for, these different types of conspiracy theories, because you could say that what changes about those power dynamics? Well, we had the rise of China. So that was a decrease in Christian aligned wealth to atheist aligned wealth. Right. You had the rise of India. So that was an increase of Hindu aligned wealth. Then you had the petrodollar, which built vast sovereign wealth fund, which is Muslim aligned wealth. And so now you end up with rising powers and falling powers, and then they're able to buy the West. And so because the West is for sale, you've got the Gulf countries which are buying the West right now. Trump brags about how much inbound investment is happening in America. What does that mean? Inbound investment, think of what the IMF model was. The IMF model was to enforce the world into debt slavery and dollar dependency. Yeah. How do you do it? By turning countries into distress, devaluing their currencies, and then using predatory loans in order to bail them out. And then they become subordinate to your power structure. So when Trump is bragging about $17 trillion of inbound investment, he's basically saying these are the power structures that are now going to control America. Because foreign direct investment means that you own more of the ownership structure of the country because the country is subordinate to the corporate interest. Right. And so, the answer is people want to think of it like a conspiracy. The answer is everything's a lie. Power changes fluidly. Yeah. But if you really want to put who's at the top of the structure, it's still access to capital flows and finance. And so JP Morgan, BlackRock, institutions that also have access to who's the deep state. Right. Well, the deep state, where was it created? You've got to go back. It was created from MI6, the British Empire, pre-World War I. They used covert wars in order to do their colonial expeditions and mercantilism to conquer gold and silver. They would get China addicted through opium wars, install a bank like HSBC, conquer Hong Kong, and then steal all the silver from China. Or they would take the tea trade. They would do a genocide of 50 million Indian people.
Mm-hmm.
Then they would access their tea resources, their culture, and then they would convert it to gold. And eventually power dynamics changed. As the British Empire fell, it got too complicated. But the power dynamics of the deep state, MI6, that remained. And so if you look at what happened after World War II, who was the power in America? Well, most of the gold from the world ended up in Fort Knox. So you had the Federal Reserve, the shareholders of the Federal Reserve were the banks. They ended up with a vast chunk of Germans' gold, many of the British gold, much of the British gold, much of the gold that left with the creation of the Soviet Union, with the overthrow of the Tsar, all ended up in Fort Knox Federal Reserve. They created an IMF structure, which is everyone stop converting your currency to gold, convert it to dollars, and we'll convert it to gold if you don't trust dollars.
Right.
And so that became like the default structure. And after World War, who else was powerful? Well, there were factions of power. There was what happened to the Nazis. Through Operation Paperclip, they merged into the CIA. They also had the Jewish mafia. Again,
Mm-hmm.
people think that I'm saying Jews are the mafia. I'm saying just like there was an Italian mafia,
right.
there was a mafia that was associated with the Jewish identity. There was a few people that had power in that structure. There was also the Italian mafia. So if you look at the formation of the CIA, it came from the post-World War II Bretton Woods order, partnership between the factions of Nazi Germany, the Jewish mob, the Italian mob. And what were they doing? It was a partnership with the military-industrial complex. And so the military would get Pentagon budgets. And then what did the CIA do? Well, it needed to do black op operations off book. You can't get congressional approval. So it created different industries: drug trafficking, sex trafficking, human trafficking, and weapons trafficking. And so the CIA would support all these networks of criminal activities, build black op slush funds, launder all the money through they created, the Jewish mob created the Vatican Bank. So the partnership between the Italian mafia and the Jewish financiers, that created a Vatican bank structure, which was actually laundered through the Vatican. And so all of this was declassified in documents. There's been investigations into the Pope's role and various other things. So these are all declassified. You could read a book like Operation Gladio to understand how this happened. But anyway, the deep state is a criminal network that is sponsored for corporate interests, and the contractors that work for the government for national security are the same contractors that work for the military industrial complex and financial industrial complex. And so if you're BlackRock and you're managing a vast portfolio, you can just create a portfolio management theory through hedging, through your banks and hedge funds. You can use the deep state via the military industrial complex to operate covert wars. You can get access to Pentagon budgets, and then you can hedge both bets of outcomes of the war and consolidate more power. So I put it to you that when you've studied books like read Covert Regime Change, it was a book of the 100 covert wars executed via this structure, to topple governments, destabilize colored revolutions, install political interference. Every war is unnatural.
Which
all the wars are unnatural.
What are the names of each of these books that you're recommending?
So if you want to understand about declassified CIA documents on wars, like Covert Regime Change, if you want to read about
it's called Covert
Regime Change.
Okay.
You could read Operation Gladio. That explains how terrorism works today. So these stay-at-home armies, what's happening in Nigeria, they fund these militia groups, use them in order to destabilize countries so that they can extract their resources and blame it on religion. And then they use religion in order to create these destabilization campaigns. So at the moment, I believe there's a destabilization campaign in the West, which is inciting Jewish hatred, Muslim hatred, using open borders, closed borders, in order to create religious and racial tensions.
Yeah.
So that you can install the next layer of regulations like the Patriot Act.
Yeah.
So that you can usher in your artificial intelligence and surveillance state. So, Operation Gladio is a good book by Paul Williams to understand these structures. I recommend to understand the IMF, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, to understand the Federal Reserve. I recommend like The Creature from Jekyll Island is a classic. If you want to understand the history of central banking, the history of central banking and the enslavement of mankind. If you want to understand blackmail operations, Whitney Webb's done some good work, One Nation Under Blackmail. All I'd say is it's a journey. And I've been reading for 25 years and kind of putting it together. And so this proof of weapons network structure is kind of once you understand how these flows work, it's so obvious. It's so like you can read any war, any media, and you can follow the monetary flows. And I do this every week on my YouTube channel to help people understand how everything you're being told is a lie.
That's amazing.
Because it's this corporate structure that really manages. And again, I'm not saying that they're the ultimate power structure. There are resistance. There are sovereign countries like China, Russia, the Gulf countries, various others.
Yeah.
But the West is collectively through neoliberal, quote unquote capitalism, which has got nothing to do with capitalism. It is essentially subordinate to this decentralized control structure that can install a president, install a prime minister, manipulate any type of election. And so, you can see the CIA manipulates every election around the world. And then you wonder if they do it to themselves. Of course they do it to themselves. And so you don't need to fall for this left, right, Republican, Democrat, Labor, conservative. None of that matters. No. You have no say. It's just a game to distract you from what really moves the world, which is money and capital flows.
So let's get into that, because this has been one of the most fascinating history lessons that I've ever had. I'm sure my audience will really appreciate that. Is the U.S. actually going to start actively acquiring gold, or is it, Bitcoin, or is that some sort of just show of confiscating Bitcoin? Like, what are your thoughts on how we move forward here?
Okay. Let me try and break it down. So where we are is, I believe, a transition to a multipolar world. And a multipolar world means we have this power structure called America that controls the collective West, but America is not sovereign. It's controlled by the corporate interests of the proof of weapons network. So the West is subordinate to BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, and the corporate interests and the nodes on the network. So what do they want is the question to answer what happens to the West. Then you have different countries that have recognized there is a change of power structure in the world. And so what is America? So America was originally, the British Empire handed over to the American Empire. And there was a controlled handover from the Bank of England to the Federal Reserve. The power bankers, they had 3 attempts at installing a central bank in America. That led to assassinations, deaths, but eventually they got the Federal Reserve in 1913. Then they created World War I. Then they had a gap in between. They created the Bank for International Settlements to redistribute the gold. And then they went into World War II. Yeah. And then after World War II, they created the Bretton Woods order. And so if you look at the dollar, you had the Great British Pound, which was strategically weakened in order to have gold outflows from the UK because the government was essentially bankrupted and the empire got so complicated they could no longer manage all the moving parts. And so America built a military, an industrial base. And because they had the manufacturing base, they ended up essentially, and they avoided the war, everyone just blew each other up. they provided all the weapons. And because they were manufacturing the weapons without having it fired on their ground, they managed to take over the British Empire. And that was managed through the transition from the Bank of England to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve then took the government from virtually zero debt to $38 trillion of debt in its 110 years. That was World War I, World War II, the Cold War, the Korean War, the Vietnamese War, the fake war on terror, and the financialization and securitization through the benefit systems of every product. And so if you look at the debt, it really is just war, interest, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, which is managed by the financial industrial complex, and interest. And so the financial industrial complex receives all the interest on the debt. Now, yes, is it through financial products and owed to other people? Absolutely. It's a vast web. But essentially, the balance sheet of the Fed is a chunk of the debt, $10 trillion. They QT, QE, if they want to manipulate, change the rate, all that type of stuff, all the planning that happens there. But the banks are essentially the net beneficiary of all that interest via the largest lender to the UK government, which is Cayman Islands. Cayman Islands is who? Is your fund. And it's got its nodes. It's got Japan. It's got UK. It's got the subordinate power structures that print their currency, lend it to the US, buy those treasuries. As long as people are buying treasuries, the dollar continues.
Right.
And so they are looking to do more and more elaborate schemes. So let's look at the history of the dollar. The dollar was backed by gold, had a relationship with the Great British Pound, and the dollar became an important country because it was backed by gold and its manufacturing base. Then more and more gold piled into Fort Knox. I think Fort Knox then allowed the Fed to collateralize it. And so the beneficiary of the gold was the private banks. Went into a Great Depression, did a pump and dump, confiscated all the Americans' gold, refilled the coffers by making gold ownership illegal, and then collateralized it and financialized it further through the Federal Reserve for their shareholders, the banks. The shareholders of the Federal Reserve receive a 6% dividend on all the assets on the balance sheet. So you can use these different mechanisms for manipulating the dollar. So you had a gold-backed currency. Then you had the Federal Reserve System, which levered up the gold reserves. Then you use the military-industrial complex. And the Treaty of Versailles was between World War I and World War II, where they renegotiated money by taking all of Germany's gold and putting it over. Then you move to the next stage, the Bretton Woods system, which is the dollar will be backed by gold and everyone convert your currencies into ours. And we'll do a Marshall Plan. We'll rebuild your country if you choose us over communism. They were funding both sides. So whichever side succeeded, they were managing and hedging their bets, which is a feature of the proof of weapons network. But the dollar became their tool because the Federal Reserve is owned by the banks get to create the dollar, and then they can perpetuate debt globally. And then they had the IMF and World Bank to export debt around the world. But then when they spent too much and the government was too indebted, and you had an inflationary cycle, you had stagflation, the Vietnamese War was a step too far. JFK decided to take on the military-industrial complex. The deep state decided to assassinate him. Then we had LBJ go into power. And you had the end of the Vietnamese War. And then we went into Nixon, 1971. Yeah. The French decided to pull up their ships and say, give me your gold, give me my gold. They said no, and then they defaulted and closed the gold standard. So then America got to keep the gold that was left. It was collateralized by the Fed. And then we entered into the full fiat standard in 1971, which was, as long as people will buy our treasuries, then the government can take on all the debt. We can use the stock market and the bond market to give people 0% interest loans. They can pump up the price of our stocks, and we'll rinse the consumer until they won't borrow anymore. We'll collateralize student loans, we'll collateralize auto loans, we'll collateralize mortgages, real estate, everything. In fact, you've reached the stage right now where you can buy some food from a supermarket and you have a pay per month and you can borrow against your food because people can't afford their food, right?
Yeah.
So eventually you reach the end of a debt cycle. So if you're BlackRock and you're the Proof of Weapons Network and you're State Street Vanguard and you're meeting in a World Economic Forum meeting, and you've got a Bilderberg meeting with the technical industrial complex, and you're putting out signals of where you're trying to move the capital flows, you create games to reset the world order. One of those, a massive tool, was, I'm not saying whether they did it on purpose. There's people that believe that COVID was created in a lab. There was funding from Fauci into the Wuhan lab. I don't even go down there. Just pretend it was a natural event. It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant because they weaponized it in order to consolidate much power into the Proof of Weapons Network. You got everyone using their phones. You got everyone ordering from Amazon. You got people voluntarily sitting at home watching content. YouTube's traffic went through the roof. All of the tools of the Proof of Weapons Network went through the roof. We got addicted to phones. We got addicted to devices. Everyone went on the control structure. You can't even be productive if you're not in this structure. Mm-hmm. You even started to ruin human psyche. We had massive pornography addiction, massive degeneracy. People didn't even know what their sexual orientation is anymore. I'm just talking about by controlling these operations, they basically rendered humans useless, and now the birth rates have gone absolutely down. If you look at the statistics right now, you've got record mental issues, record suicide rates, record financial exclusion, homelessness, drug addiction, the lowest birth rates. And so if you're looking at a spreadsheet and you're BlackRock and you're deciding how you want to manage your portfolio, you go, who's having the children today? Africa's still doing them, got them. And the Muslim nations are still having children. But everyone else isn't having children anymore. So where does the labor come? Okay, let's reset the world order and let's make sure that we allow Africa to grow. Let's allow the Middle Eastern energy that we want to utilize. Let's end the forever war over there. Let's vassalize Europe and destroy Europe. How do we do that? Well, we escalate a coup in 2014 with Ukraine. You push it forward with NATO expansion. You agitate Russia. And then you destroy Europe because they need access to cheap energy. That energy is now sanctioned. And so therefore, Germany can no longer manufacture its manufacturing base. And therefore, Europe is big Germany. You do open borders policies. You change the demographics. You use media in order to make people think they're defending democracy. And then you have open borders, closed borders, and you fuel religious tensions by pushing out in the algorithms. The Muslims are taking over. The Jews rule the world. You're in danger, and you fuel up racial and religious tensions. And now Europe is fully vassalized. Blackstone comes in, buys all the water assets, buys all the land, buys all the real estate, buys all the property, buys all the politicians, pushes up the price of real estate, and you push up the price of assets. And now money printing is just used to push up the price of assets and enslave the people into debt. And then you get more and more wealth inequality, which creates more, radicalism. You end up either extreme on the right, trying to protect your assets and escape the country. That's UK. Or you end up extreme on the left, supporting in the US Mandani, looking for, you're looking for the government to protect you because you don't know what else to do. Right. Like you are out of the system. And that creates this environment of civil unrest. That's where we are today. Now, you then recognize that you try to infiltrate other countries. You're like, well, who can we get? So what was the source of the Russian conflict. So you had the fall of the Soviet Union in 91. Then you had, the end of the Cold War. Earlier was the end of the Cold War. Then you had the fall of the Soviet Union. And then they had the oligarchs that would financialize, securitize Russia. And then eventually Putin came in, arrested the people that would, and nationalized the oil. Great. He's the new Hitler. Let's make him the new Hitler. And if we can escalate war with Russia, we can destroy Europe and vassalize Europe into our control grids. And they can buy all of our oil. We can get them to print and have NATO budgets. We can just essentially use the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, in order to push up the price of our stocks. That's one game. But Russia is sovereign, and that's why he's public enemy number one. We also need to bring back the fake war on terror. Okay, so what do we need to do? Well, we'll go into Iraq. We'll radicalize a bunch of people, kill their families. We'll create a narrative of weapons of mass destruction. We'll take down the Twin Towers. We'll radicalize the Christians go into war with the Muslims. And then we'll also push and enslave, do essentially Israel, which is radicalize the Jews in order to think that they're in danger, radicalize the Muslims, and radicalize the Christians. So that they have successfully achieved, which was to destabilize the Middle East, so to make sure that they can never compete with the dollar. The problem is that they've now got sovereign wealth and they're buying the proof of weapons network. And so they get to kind of buy their freedom in a sense. So they're going through a decolonization process by partnering with the proof of weapons network. Dangerous game. They have to partner with the financial terrorists. But then they get to use their energy. And then there is a rising power that said, okay, how do we take on the dollar in the Middle East, the petrodollar? Well, China said, firstly, America became oil independent. That changed the world. That happened during the Biden administration. They invented fracking, and America is now an oil and gas exporter. That completely changes the game. That means that they're no longer buying, Saudi Arabian oil so that they can have oil reserves and they can prop up buy treasuries. That changes the game completely. And most people didn't even notice it. They didn't work through what are the implications. Well, China doesn't have energy. So it invests in renewable energy, every form of energy it possibly can. It genuinely is looking for all of those different types of energy. BlackRock co-invests and said, I tell you what, let's destroy Germany. Let's blow up Nord Stream pipeline. Let's agitate a war. Let's get them to invest all their money in renewable energy that we know that they need cheap gas in order to, they don't have their cheap gas. We get them to switch off their nuclear power plants. And we get them to invest trillions in renewable energy. Right. Let's radicalize people through climate change. Right. Let's do ESG scores. Let's give them a climate score. Let's give them literally a carbon credit score. And let's reset, we'll reset power structures and power dynamics. And let's co-invest. Who created the name BRICS? It was Goldman Sachs. So people think that there is US versus China. No. US is captured by the Proof of Weapons Network. The Proof of Weapons Network is a global institution that wants globalism. And they are partnering with China and these different regional power blocks in order to reset the world order and weaken the dollar in order to push capital flows into other regions. But before they do it, they want to own as many of the assets as they can. And so tariff policy was perfect for that. So tariff policy was perfect. It 100% helped BRICS that were aligning and various other. So anyway, the power structure is the Proof of Weapons Network controls the West. And then you have regional blocks that have regional sovereignty by actually partnering together. There's BRICS, there's ASEAN, there's the SCO, there's the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. And all of these blocks have said, we can partner together to decolonize and de-dollarize. But who is the most important customer now? Who's buying all the oil? Who's buying all the gas? Who's providing the manufacturing base? It's China. And so China is the customer, and it is going around and saying, hey, we'll take all of these and we'll build you up. We just want you to be a sovereign country again. We want our control, of course. This is in our interest. But let's reverse the IMF. Let's reverse it. You buy using our currency. We'll create a structure where we can do barter. All of this is happening. If US sanctions you, you can circumvent sanctions. You can work with us, and we'll reinvest through the Belt and Road Initiative so that you don't need the IMF loan anymore. So IMF has gone down and down and down. Belt and Road Initiative has gone up and up and up. And what did they do? They formed an alliance called Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And then they partnered with the Gulf countries, added Iran, added UAE, added Egypt, and tried to add Saudi Arabia. But Saudi said, you're the most important customer. I've got the petrodollar. I don't like Biden, so we'll make his economy bad. We'll create an inflationary cycle. We'll wait for Trump. Trump will do the tariffs, and then we'll buy up the US, all of the US assets. We'll co-invest with the proof of weapons network. What happens during that time? Suddenly, BlackRock set up their office in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Aramco got a board seat on BlackRock. And every single deal that the financial industrial complex, including the purchase of X, all of the artificial intelligence, was co-invested with the Gulf countries. And so the power structure that controls America is not America first. It is using America for its capital markets while it hedges, because the dollar is owned by the proof of weapons network. It is not for the American people. It is for the proof of weapons network and those that own the same assets. And so only those that own the stocks are the ones that can co-invest with this proof of weapons network. And that's the power structure. They're not trying to save America. They're saying, we're going to weaken the dollar to get capital outflows so that we can invest in as many of those countries outside America. We'll give them regional stability, but we use war in order to negotiate rebuild contracts.
Yeah.
And so once we get the rebuild contracts, we can start again. But eventually we lose the dollar, because we can only rinse this for as long as we can. For as long as people will buy bonds, and we can find a way of buying bonds, then what do we need? Well, this is going to lead to civil unrest. How are we going to control these people? Universal basic income, surveillance state, police state, stable coins, tokenization. We need to be ready. The biggest enemy are the American people and the European people. We need to make sure that we have all the control structure. And so they bought Trump, who was the biggest lobby contributors. Elon Musk, 150 million. Miriam Adelson, 100 million, which is Israel policy. And the Bank of New York Mellon family. Larry Ellison's various other technical industrial complex, financial industrial complex. And they said, right, Trump, deregulate, stimulate the stock market, implement your tariff policy that you've always talked about, and then we can make all the small businesses in America that can't afford the import tax bankrupt. The stock market can do mergers and acquisitions. We'll buy up all the small businesses, because remember, America is an importer, not an exporter. So the importer generally pays the tariff. So all the money coming in is a tax on American small business. The large business say, I'll offset it with my China plant and my India plant and my global structure, so we don't pay it. And then when they're in distress, we'll acquire them. It's another COVID operation.
Yeah.
All of the export countries will buy them. And then all the countries, what are they going to do? They're going to say, I'm not trading with America. I'm going to sell my dollars. I'm going to sell my treasuries, convert them into dollars, and then redeploy them in other countries. And everyone is now negotiating with their relative blocks. And so America is being shrunk into a regional power, and it will be a regional power. It's going to control Mexico. It's going to control Canada. It's going to control Europe. It's going to continue to make up for lost profits by raging war in Latin America and various other regions. But it cannot exert influence outside of the region. Right. And now we split the world up into multipolarity. and now the dollar has competition. So we will use the dollar for as long as possible in order to get as much investment in the war zones, and then we'll negotiate rebuild contracts and regional stability, and then reinvest in a multipolar world. Now it won't be as profitable because we don't control China's currency, we don't control those other aspects. So we need to vassalize as much as possible while we hedge, but we're going to shrink America into a regional power. Trump, you tell everyone how this is MAGA and it's going to make America great again. The rich are going to get richer, the poor are going to get poorer. People are going to get wrecked if they don't own the assets that the proof of weapons network owns. So then we go back into Bitcoin ETFs and gold pump.
I want you to talk about, are there other assets that besides Bitcoin and gold that are going to keep you surviving in this future?
Okay, so look, you can either, here's the thing that I say to people, right? If you're co-invested with the proof of weapons network, if you own stocks and shares, and you allow BlackRock to manage your money, then you're probably going to be on the right side of this change. However, through deregulation, they're doing dumping of their private equity, various other things within that. The problem is that you're giving more power to BlackRock. And I think you should boycott. Because here's the real thing. Your vote doesn't matter, but your money does. So throughout, for example, the war, I call it a genocide in Israel, in Palestine. Throughout that time, people started boycotting Starbucks like crazy. Their share price went down 10%. Their executive was investing in illegal settlements. He had to leave. They do listen when it hits them. This is how you do control. Where you spend your money determines, whether they listen or not. And if you can affect their profits and share price, and you can make it more profitable to invest in a different way, they listen to that. And that does happen. And so the money is your vote, right? And so boycotting is highly effective. So how do you boycott this system? Well, you may not be able to change the system because the reality is Bitcoin's split in two and gold is as well. You got gold that you own and gold ETFs. Mm-hmm. And gold held in custody with in Switzerland, in Dubai, in these jurisdictions in Singapore, and some of them, So if you own it in custody, then it's not, if you don't have self custody of it, then you're at risk that it's not your weapon. It can be confiscated. It has been confiscated.
Yeah.
It's not quite a boycott. It's better than nothing. It's better than an ETF. But most people just buy ETFs. ETF is a mechanism for giving your money, allowing them to buy gold for you, and then them having the gold in their control. And if you do your shares with them, you buy ETFs, you even give your voting rights, and you give them more leverage to get a board seat in the company.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's one thing you can do to protect yourself. And I judge nobody if they want to do that because this is complicated, right? Another thing you can do is you can say, well, resetting the world order, what is Bitcoin and gold now? It's a liquidity sponge. So if you're managing a massive change in the world, like I believe BlackRock and various power structures are, you create liquidity sponges for people that want to manage the transition. That's what the central banks are doing with gold right now. Central banks are trying to accumulate as much gold as possible. They're not buying gold, they're selling dollars, right? So they're hedging away from the dollar. That's what all central banks are doing right now. Now, what did BlackRock do? Well, BlackRock engineered a game to take over as much of the crypto market as it could. Used the Biden administration to do that. Then set up a game where they could get the ETF approved and use the Trump administration in order to deregulate and get all of their companies, all of the banks and financial institutions and anyone into Bitcoin. And so it becomes a alternative liquidity sponge, but they say you have to do it via the Bitcoin ETF. We want you to own Bitcoin, but we want to custody it with Coinbase, and we'll make sure that Coinbase is on the proof of weapons network. We'll take them public. Anyone that goes public will also create other vehicles like Strategy. We'll recruit Michael Saylor, get as much Bitcoin as possible. You advocate for Bitcoin, put it in a public company. We'll increase our shareholding. Once it hits S&P 500, we'll get passive investment. We'll also create an ETF for blockchain. We'll own the mining companies. Let's get as many miners to set up in Texas. We'll vassalize them, securitize them, get as much control as we can over the mining network, and basically use all the tools that they could. Then Trump will deregulate. Then they can put Bitcoin on their balance sheet. The banks can put it on their balance sheet. Then people can borrow against their Bitcoin. We use some of our primary dealer brokers in different nodes like Cantor Fitzgerald. They can get as many people to borrow against their Bitcoin. We can then decide when we want to elaborately get margin calls. We can manipulate markets up and down. We can liquidate. We can create leverage. We can create futures. We can create options. So they're constructing all the financial weapons of mass destruction to try and persuade you to give your Bitcoin to them.
Right.
And then they're going to try and get you to borrow against it. And then they're going to try and get you to invest in public companies rather than Bitcoin. And now they've got 2 million
Bitcoin. They're
Bitcoin.
going to liquidate you and take your Bitcoin. And
Exactly. Anyone that was around in 2021, you know what that looks like on the cowboy level. Now the big boys.
Man. I lost a lot of Bitcoin in COVID.
Yeah. So they created a Bitcoin financial industrial complex. The crypto lobbyists pushed the world to stable coins. The banks drafted Genius Act and made it in favor for them, but also have all these stablecoin issuers so they could build the technical industrial complex. You get rogue stablecoins like Tether that now have to set up in the US. And now they have a board which recruited the White House team. And then you get them to buy the ballroom. So they're investing in the White House ballroom right now. And so you create a crypto lobby, this rise of this new lobby, which is turning a Bitcoin strategy that could have saved the dollar into weaponizing the dollar for corporate interest again. And so you have this new rise of this new corporate, which is a stablecoin issuer. Trump's family issue one, Steve Witkoff's family start investing in the industry, and all these different things. I could go deep into it. But what do they want? So then I get to, how do you actually boycott the network and protect yourself at the same time? Well, the boycott of the dollar is created by the banks are the shareholders of the Fed. And so if you want to boycott the proof of weapons network, you buy Bitcoin or you buy gold. Now, Bitcoin in self-custody is where you actually boycott. If you buy an ETF, you're stuck in, they'll get you to borrow against it, and then you'll mine some fiat currency and they'll margin call your Bitcoin when they can. And so you give them power by doing that. And then by borrowing against your Bitcoin, you have mined some fiat currency and you're empowering the banks and the proof of weapons network. And so they create very elaborate tax incentives to do it, inheritance incentives to do it. And once you buy a Bitcoin ETF, you ain't selling that ETF, taking a tax hit, figuring out how to get it into dollars, taking those dollars, buying Bitcoin and putting it in self-custody. Let's face it, no one's doing that, right? So then you also create these Bitcoin treasury companies. You go back to all the original Bitcoiners and say, hey, I've managed to lobby a really nice tax structure. Give me a Bitcoin and put it in this company. And then we'll raise you a couple of $1 billion and you can buy more Bitcoin. You can lever it right up. And we'll end up buying those companies in Chapter 11 once we push it to a discount to the Bitcoin net asset value. And so they've got all these elaborate schemes to make sure that you don't own your Bitcoin in self-custody. And they're doing very well. As a financial industrial complex, they've now got approximately 2 million Bitcoin under Wall Street financial weapons of mass destruction. The big
And that happened in such a short amount of time. It's crazy. Like what, 2 years really? That all happened?
Yeah, and remember, sorry, I could go conspiratorial, but I was a creditor in the Celsius bankruptcy. I know every detail because I read 4,000 pages of documents. Every document that went through that court. I know the deep state connections of every single hack and every single thing, and where the families, where the people that were behind that Ponzi scheme are now, and who they're working with. And I'll give you a clue. They've got AI startups with the Prime Minister's Office of Israel, and some of the hacks were done by those that owned companies like Bank or Dow that were actually shareholders, were the niece and nephew of Benjamin Netanyahu. Mossad goes back through to CIA, deep state. Sam Bankman-Fried, he was the only one that got a meeting. Who took out the crypto-friendly banks? Signature, Silvergate. They were the ones that were providing the blockchain dollar structure for Alameda Capital and FTX. Who in that network? Who was it? So all I'm saying is, I'm not saying that there's an elaborate conspiracy theory, but there was an operation, and it was called Operation Choke Point 2.0. And I believe that members of the Federal Reserve and that the highest power of structure were involved in that elaborate pump and dump scheme, because the end result was financial capture of the Bitcoin industry. That was the end result. Now, you have Bitcoin in self-custody and you have Bitcoin in Wall Street. That's the new game.
I think
empower the proof of weapons network by giving them your Bitcoin, or you continue to boycott the system and own it in self-custody. I'm not sure whether we're going to win, because people are too gullible and convenient, and the tax incentives are just far too tempting. Right. And people are broke, so they're borrowing against their Bitcoin in order to mine some fiat currency. And Michael Saylor told them all to do it. And the logic of why to do it makes sense.
Yeah,
but
it does make sense.
It does make sense. But there's not so many principled people. So all these old school Bitcoiners are setting up Bitcoin treasury companies and converting 30,000 Bitcoin into, and then levering it up and just doing it. And they're creating not quite the crypto industrial complex that led to the fraud and Ponzi's and all the stuff of Celsius and BlockFi and Voyager and FTX. But there's definitely a regulated version that's emerging. And it's just as Ponzi, because remember, the banks, they own the Fed. They own the Treasury. They own the lobby. They can privatize the gains and socialize the losses. And so you are their exit liquidity. They want your Bitcoin. Yeah. And they will make sure, if you're not managing this well, that they get your Bitcoin by hook or by crook. And they want more Bitcoin. And it is a liquidity sponge while they manage this transition. And then eventually they'll look to price these products in different currencies. So they're doing that now. They're launching Australian ETFs, European ETFs, Hong Kong ETFs. And they're doing that with all of their products, all of their ETFs, and they're hedging their bets. They will rinse the dollar until no one will buy those treasuries, and then they'll sell them to stable coins, and they'll dump them all on the American people until the American people are on a universal basic income. And guess how they'll get their first check? The stable coin.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so here's the irony, right? The irony is that Trump's vision, I want all Bitcoin. I know he doesn't understand Bitcoin. He's reading a script. He's been told that he needs to support this. He's got crypto lobby. He's got his family. They're getting rich from it. They know, Trump knows where the financial industrial complex are taking the world. Trump's investing all his money in the Gulf. He's going to set up he's going to get a Trump Tower in Saudi and UAE, and he's trying to buy Gaza. He's facilitating, the purchase of all American assets by the Gulf countries. One of his largest sources of loans is ICBC, the largest bank in China. So I'm saying all I do is, again, people might think I got Trump derangement syndrome. If Biden was in charge, I'd do the exact same thing of everything that's happening with Biden, right?
Yeah.
This is a power structure that no one is subordinate to. Trump has narrative that makes people think he's making America great again. He is shrinking America through manufacturing chaos into the vision that the financial industrial complex and the proof of weapons network paid him to do, which is regional power. America, get in your box, and we're going to have capital flows into the Gulf countries, and they're partnered with BRICS, and there's different power plays that are happening, along that way. And China's the manufacturing base. We need you to get as independent as we can, but in manufacturing this, so you've got America. The worst thing you could do for Bitcoin is give more power to America, because America is the financial industrial complex. And so they're not building Bitcoin strategic reserves. They're confiscating Bitcoin from criminal activities. They're issuing stable coins, and they're building the surveillance state, and they're creating pro-bank regulations for crypto and this stable coin standard. Yeah. They're allowing you to buy, own some Bitcoin, but what else was in the Genius Act? It was they're arresting the Samurai Wallet team, self-custody. The DOJ is coming after them at all full force. They're saying that in the Genius Act and the Clarity Act, they don't want you to use individual wallet addresses on your hardware wallet, so you can obfuscate your transactions. And they're saying don't use coin joins. So they're disincentivizing self-custody. They're giving you narrative with anti-CBDC. We're not like Europe, them control people, but they're giving all the power to the proof of weapons network. Okay, so America is then using the weapons to get as much of the mining industry. Now, what do we know about Bitcoin? We know that Bitcoin is anti-fragile, right? We know we've got all of our history. Bitcoin survives, by the way, but the psyop is that the more Bitcoin held within the financial industrial complex structure, by turning Coinbase into a public company, by creating Bitcoin treasury companies, by having Michael Saylor that's using all the debt capital markets and the equity capital markets, by having Cantor Fitzgerald borrow against your Bitcoin, by having World Liberty Financial stable coins, by having all of the constructs that everybody is buying into, by creating as many Bitcoin mining companies, by even trying to pay the developers to push the direction that we want the code to go, right? Which is why we need competing. And fortunately, Bitcoin is proof of work. So we know you've got nodes. So people need to run their own nodes if we want to maintain power. And it doesn't have to be everybody, but enough of us need to do it. We need to have competing implementations of Bitcoin Core. We need to have strategies in case they get corrupted. We need to make sure that the mining is geographically diversified outside of America, which is why, you had China ban. Suddenly the industry grew in Texas. Suddenly you had all the companies go in public. Yeah. This is how much control can we gain? And then you need to not borrow against it. You need to hold it in self-custody. So here's the thing. America is gaining more and more power. The more power America gains over Bitcoin in centralized Wall Street wrappers, the more power you're giving to the financial industrial complex. What can they do with that power? Well, the more power you give them, the more ability do they have to short-term manipulate the price of Bitcoin to try and get your Bitcoin. The more power you give them to try and steal your Bitcoin through margin calls in legal ways, and the more power they get in order to build all of the derivatives tools. What can't they control? As long as there is node operators, as long as there is competing miners globally, as long as there is competing development teams, this is still the most decentralized thing that exists in the world, and we need to maintain that. But you need to decide, am I going to empower the proof of weapons network, or am I going to boycott the proof of weapons network? So you have those two-tiered power structures. The beauty is that if you boycott it, it does come with a reward. You get to own your own money. You get to spend your own money, and you get the benefit of number goes up technology from the fixed supply. But the more power you give them, the more they will short-term manipulate it. And here's the thing. If you're borrowing against your Bitcoin and you're levered up to the tilt, and you're trading shit coins, you're borrowing against it, you're wrapping it in Ethereum, you're doing DeFi contracts, you're buying houses. And if you are levered up too much, they can outweigh you. It's a time game. You want to own your Bitcoin because they can't manipulate the price long term, just like they can't manipulate the price of gold long term. And so they will use their patience and your impatience because you're levered. Why do they want you buying futures, options, borrowing against it? Because what it does is it adds time to your money. Where if you are levered, you can firstly get overexposed.
Yeah.
And you have to trade to meet a certain time frame before that options contract expires, before that perpetual futures. The more you add time to your money through their products and you lever, the more likely you are to lose your Bitcoin and then end up with it. And they will patiently wait because they can outweigh you. They can definitely outweigh you. So the more leverage you use, the more custody you use, the more wrappers you use, the more things that aren't Bitcoin that look like Bitcoin that you invest in, the more you're empowering an enemy, and they will outweigh you. So that's how we win. And those with Bitcoin in self-custody that are running nodes, they're the resistance.
Yeah.
And you need to become a part of the resistance because there's major benefits. If they try and confiscate those Bitcoin in self-custody, you can take your Bitcoin with you and go wherever you need to go. That comes with you, self-custody.
Yeah.
Try and get your ETF over the border when they're trying to confiscate. Ain't going to happen.
Mm-mm.
And try and spend your Bitcoin ETF.
Right.
Ain't going to happen. And that's the interesting thing. You don't need to know any of this stuff. But if you do one thing, spend less than you earn and save the difference in Bitcoin, own more Bitcoin this month than the next month. And as your wealth grows, do it for a minimum of 4 years. That's the 4-year challenge. Every month for 4 years.
Yeah.
You won't go back. It will be a lifetime once you've done that because I've said this ever since Bitcoin was $3. And I'd say this at $110,000 today. Same thing. Own more Bitcoin this month than last month. Ideally, if you're going to borrow against it, I'm not going to judge you. If you're going to borrow against it because you have to manage your finances, make sure that you're only doing that with a percentage of the Bitcoin you're willing to lose. Even if you don't lose it, just make sure you're only levering. Don't lever 100% of your Bitcoin. Only borrow against a fraction of your Bitcoin if you are going to do it because you need to manage your flows. Ideally, don't do it at all. Ideally, and definitely own it in self-custody. Eventually you could end up running a node. And here's what I'd say. It's a journey. You don't need to get all this shit right away. It's a journey. It's overwhelming. It's information overload. It's crazy. Commit to own. If you're on 0 Bitcoin, just buy it regardless of the price today. Own more next month. Learn how to take it off an exchange and put it in self-custody. Commit to that first step and do it every month for 4 years. And just do that one thing and then join the journey and we'll take the whole journey together.